To begin today's show, I'd like to share a vignette from my book, Language of the Soul, A Path of Simplicity, entitled Growing Up. In 1974, Tom Robbins, a renowned author, gave a commencement address at a small alternative school. Amongst the thoughts he shared that evening was the distinction between the notion of growing up as a demarcation point in life versus the need for growing throughout life. He described other speakers at other commencements talking about maturity, the need to face hallowed responsibilities. That at age 18, we suddenly and magically get it together. He then stated that the sad, funny truth is adults are nothing but tall children who have forgotten how to play. I have met few provocations that I recognize as more important to living a vibrant life than this one. It presents us with an uncomfortable truth our culture simply doesn't want to acknowledge. The moment we stop seeing life as play, we also stop growing in really significant ways.
Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, in our previous episode, we spoke about the technological singularity and its perverse forms of expression that show up in our world. War, xenophobia, governmental systems of induced economic and spiritual poverty, and a true lack of responsibility for those with money and power. We then spoke to how this has created an all-consuming weirdness in our lives. It's altered consciousness and thus our world in such an undeniably radical and, if I may be so bold to use this word, treacherous way. And yet, this singularity has arrived at a potent nexus point where it's now meeting our innate connection to our lives, to the planet. And in this way, through this connection, we find at its heart this opportunity for conscious change. That conscious change can help radicalize our communities and come together to co-create a conscious revolution that's rooted in inner practice, personal truth, and shared values in sustainability, creativity, and compassion.
You speak of what exists at the heart of conscious change, and it brings immediately to mind the Buddhist monks.
Right. Over the winter, they traveled all the way from Texas to Washington, D.C. in what is now known as the Walk for Peace.
Right. And if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Walk for Peace, you see that these Buddhist monks are known as the Venerable monks. That word venerable, it's a form of honoring, of respect, of reverence. It's a formal title used by religion to acknowledge a kind of first state of what's referred to as canonization. In other words, let's put them on this pedestal and let's acknowledge this amazing thing that these monks have done. And yes, I say that there is a legitimate need to acknowledge these human beings having done this wondrous thing of walking and touching hundreds of communities, all in the name of peace. Their intention, their breathing, the way they rested, the sense of peace that could be felt because it was embodied in their actions, right? The fact that they really weren't there seeking to manipulate or strategize for control. What we can take from that is their potent intention, which is their intention is to inspire us to connect to our own version of such a heartfelt, wisdom-induced choice. We need not walk from Texas to DC to express our inner truth, but we need some expression of that. And it needs to shift from, oh, let's worship these men and what they've done and their version of Superdog and all that, but rather to emulate them. What's our version of that? And what happens when a human being is willing to leap into themselves and into the possibility of their lives?
Leaping reminds me of something in the circles that I've occupied throughout my adult life, this filmmaking world, right? There's always the same message that's stemming from experienced filmmakers, people that have been making dozens of movies for decades, usually. And they say it in different ways. They have different inflections, intonations, but it always comes down to stop waiting for permission to make a film. So in this way, it's that leap, a simple yet radical message, right?
Yeah, exactly. And on a certain level, stop making the word radical into a bad word. Radical simply means a willingness to leap into something, to go for it, right? We've negated the notion of radicalism into this bad word because it's found so many negative or violent expressions. But we have to reclaim radical because it's the thing that allows us to leap into ourselves. And by taking that leap, it's not just a letting go into oneself, but it's also a letting go of the elements we need to let go of, right? It's both. We're letting go into ourselves, we're letting go of elements that might be holding us back from being our fullest self. And in that way, we're turning it into something else. Because, let's face it, the one constant in life is change. So do we embrace that? And if we embrace it, on a certain level, that is a leap. It's that simple. By embracing the change that's already occurring in our lives, instead of resisting it, we're actually taking a leap. And my experience, and I would offer universally, this is true, that when we are willing to leap, the universe gives us the baby step we need to move forward. And that if we keep listening with the willingness to leap, we'll constantly be given the baby steps needed to initiate a change that in nature is radical.
This sense of how you're framing the reclamation of radicalism within and the baby steps, how the universe responds. It's this sense that so many of the baby steps actually aren't going to be seen by others, right?
Yeah.
There are these things that occur inside. And this brings me back around to the story that you shared in our opening and how Tom Robbins created this sense of what play is. And so I see that as play being a willingness to leap because play is coming from such an intuitive and joyous place, right? We're thrilled to be figuring it out. And it's not a pursuit because it's not outside of us. I think that's something that I want to make really clear. Figuring it out isn't this grasping at straws kind of thing. It can transform into that, but I don't want to dwell there for the moment. It's inside out. And because it's inside out, it's a part of our practice. And it can be something that's disciplined. We can be disciplined in our play, but I'm not talking about it being rigid. Rigidness as in, an unwillingness to be flexible. Because when we're flexible in our art, in our creation, whether we're painting, whether we're knitting something, we're sculpting something, whether we're working on this podcast, figuring that out again and again and again, like we do, to get to this point where we're sharing in a form that will be heard by others. This is the flexibility. This is that discipline. So to hone it in on what we're doing with our podcast, I think is a really good example. When we're creating, when we're collaborating, when ideas are forming, and when there's a root of something that you might bring, and then I start to take notes and we bounce ideas off of each other and a script starts to occur, a structure starts to occur, that's not rigid. It's there in order for us to feel that there is a path that we've set up and that we can leap and leap and leap along that path. But also there's room there then so that when doubts come up, they can be dealt with in a way that is tender. Because I have a lot of doubts when we do this. And a lot of it gets externalized. A lot of it is fear based, and it pulls me out of that really intuitive sense of play. And it turns into this notion of, are we playing not just well, but are we playing in a way that is good?
Mm-hmm.
I.e., is it commercial? Is it understandable to an audience? I'm taking myself out of the work by doing that. I'm saying to myself through an imagined authority that I need permission before I even do anything. So this is important to make note of here, because when we dedicate ourselves to being flexible, there's that willingness to figure it out. And it's an expression of one's inner wisdom, as you've noted time and time again. When I pause, there's that soulful whisper. And what does it say? Play. This is what I know. It doesn't come from this place of judgment, right? It doesn't come from that limiting, fearful voice that only a millisecond ago felt so overwhelming, so all-consuming. It's not this dogged pursuit, right? We talked about the ascension culture and that hierarchy and that pursuit of things, of building, of amassing. When I notice that come up in myself, it's my senses spiraling off into the future, into somebody else's idea of what I should be doing. And here, in this soulful whisper, this quality of play, that worry really melts into everything else. It doesn't disappear, but it melts into that inner wisdom. It's not destroyed, it's transformed. And I think that that's really important when we talk about how things are practiced inside out, right?
Inside out, inside out. Of course, we exist in a shared world, right? We exist in this highly interactive world. That said, what is the nature of our interaction? Is our interaction shared? Is it play-based? Is it wisdom-driven? Or is it performative in nature? Which is what I think you're pointing at. Are we performing for another and seeking approval from the audience? Or are we bringing ourselves into the world in this kind of beautiful, vulnerable way and saying, this is who and how I will be. By all means, do with it what you will, but understand what I'm offering is coming from a practice with wisdom. It's coming from a practice with heart. And there's something really delicious about the fact that we're recording this on April 14th, which is World Quantum Day, right? The nature of quantum science and technology and quantum mechanics is this idea that on a certain level, we're all energetically connected. And there's these studies that have been done in the quantum world where we know for a fact that you take any connected beings, twins, brothers and sisters, and you do one thing to one of them in one place, and then 40 miles away, 100 miles away, 2,000 miles away, it's felt or experienced by another being who's connected to that being, right? So we know there's an interconnectivity. And what quantum mechanics studies is all of this on this microscopic level, right? But it's no less true whether we're talking about a human being or humanity itself, or we're talking about, electrons and protons and neutrons, right? We're talking about the same thing. And that interconnectivity is largely going to be dictated by how we go about doing it, how the very fabric of reality is defined or experienced is going to be determined by whether or not we're willing to be in our wisdom, we're willing to be in that heart-filled place, whether we're willing to look at our fears, our judgments, right? Because fear and judgment is not going to disappear in the midst of a conscious revolution. What's going to happen is at least if it occurs the way I've experienced it in my own life, it's going to be defined by how we all practice with it. If we face our fears, we'll have a different experience. If we push our fears away, they grow. It's that simple. And so, if the world that we're living in is defined by this dogged pursuit of material wealth and power, then that's going to define the world we live in. But what we know is that that dogged pursuit of material wealth and power has led us to an absence of ease, an absence of joy, an inflexibility, and that it's left us, by definition, in a soulless world, a world where, journalists, renowned journalists like Chris Hedges, define the leader of the free world as a soulless being because of an unwillingness to be flexible on his part, an unwillingness to be vulnerable, to dance with himself in a way that allows the inner journey to be expressed. And at a certain very intrinsic level, an abandonment within the culture of the interrelationship between the elements of everything that we articulate in our conversations here on this podcast.
Right. Healing and growth, healing and growth, healing and growth. And, I mean, through the years of like creating the podcast together, there's something fundamental about this. It's inherent. We keep having to figure out ways to bring healing and growth into this every time we sit down for a talk. It's got to be accessible in a way. It's got to be authentic to how we're feeling in that moment.
Right.
And I think there's a willingness to transform there then, right? And that is so key to what we're talking about right now. How healing and growth correlate to conscious change to take care of oneself, to heal and grow. It starts within. It goes back to that inside out mentality, but we live in such an interconnected world. What happens when we hold healing and growth within ourselves and feel those edges? It's something that comes up every day. I think anyone with an inner practice knows that. I want to make a distinction there between understands and knows that because they're practicing with it. It's embodied. When we're talking about this stuff, it can sound abstract at times because it is so personal. It is such a different thing for you, a different thing for I. But there's some foundational things there that feel important to reinstate at this moment as it pertains to what we're exploring with conscious change, healing and growth, and a revolution that's shared.
So in the book, I wrote about how healing and growth are complementary elements, companions, dance partners, that they complete each other. As medicine is practiced in this country at this time, say over the last 100, 150 years, that's a radical notion. The idea that healing without growth is somehow incomplete. And yet, if we don't acknowledge how intrinsic, how integral that relationship is, how incomplete each of them are without the other, then we're missing an enormous opportunity for our world. And really lies at the very core of what we're calling the need for a conscious revolution. Because, healing in a broad sense means we're going to cure an ailment, right? As it exists in our world today, curing that ailment looks like taking a medicine. If you're going to see a good practitioner of medicine, they're going to want to help you to get to the root cause of it. What choices, if there are any choices, that are leading you to this dis-ease, this lack of ease in yourselves? And they're seeking to help you to make things whole, to make yourself as whole as possible through your practice of life. Are you moving your body enough and in ways that serve the body? Are you eating and drinking in ways that help? How are you processing your emotions? Because the emotions that go unexpressed ultimately find expression where? In the body. So all of this, how you practice with it, is how growth comes into this. Because growth literally means to augment, to expand. So without growth in the equation, then your relationship to these basic intrinsic practices doesn't get tended to because you're not growing into the possibility of healing yourself. You're not awakening to who you are. Now, we can reverse this conversation and begin with growth and explain more fully how growth itself is, in so many ways, within this context. It's not about development. It's about awakening. How do I awaken myself at a very intrinsic level to who I am? What inspires me? What calls me to this possibility of being who I am? And if there's 8 billion people on the planet, approximately, there are literally 8 billion different pathways to this connection to a sense of purpose around who we are. Purpose not as vocation, purpose around being human. There are 8 billion ways of being human. They're all distinct. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about a conscious revolution. It's centered around how we make our choices, and are those choices connecting us more deeply to ourselves?
There are some touchstones that feel so significant within our inner practice and within our shared world that you note in the book. They're forgiveness, gratitude, and trust.
If I say to you, Ben, I love you, on a certain level, there's what my heart is feeling, and then there's what you receive. The act of offering my love to you in that verbal sense, it begs a certain question, which is, what do I mean in practice when I say I love you? There's the love that is really intended when someone says, I love you. On a certain level, it's really just to remind you that you're loved. It's a remembrance of who you are. The receiver gets to some degree, gets to receive that in the manner that they need in that moment. But then there's what's meant by the person offering that. And to some degree, we're conditioned by that because the people who tell us they love us, we generally know fairly well. They're family members. They're people close to us in our lives. We know to some degree, if we're really truthful with ourselves, we know what they mean by I love you. And it can be quite open and vibrant and without condition, or it can be highly conditional in nature. It can have very limiting qualities to what's meant by I love you, right? And so in my book, I offer a chapter on forgiveness, gratitude, and trust. If we say that the top of a stool, the thing we rest upon, we'll call that love. And we're going to say that the three legs that support that notion of love are, in fact, gratitude, forgiveness, and trust. So if we're going to define the nature of love that we're offering into the world by gratitude, forgiveness, and trust, then we need to look upon them as crucial practices to a conscious revolution, because otherwise the conditions upon which we love, and I said something earlier that I think is actually revealing about me and something that I think I'm still learning how to do, which is I think I know how to love the people in my life. And I'm still learning how to love everyone, everything. I don't say I love you to strangers. I don't say I love you to the people of Iran, right? I'm not saying I don't feel love or care, but I can hear within that my own limitations, right? Can we love without having that context in our lives of knowing that human being? And that's what I'm pointing to in all this, is this need for me to get out of my own limitations and practice with it, to be willing to love another because I've been willing to practice forgiveness, giving up all hope for a better yesterday. I'm willing to practice gratitude, a willingness to be deeply thankful for that which is in and around my life. And lastly, trust. When I think of trust, it's less about words, it's more about the experience of trust. So the way I best can feel trust in my own being, because I come from a childhood where trust was really deeply in question, my point of reference is my dog Bear. When he comes running up to me and he leans into me, that's trust. His heart is with me in that moment. It's beyond language. And so the practice of those three legs of the stool, in whatever way, shape, or form that you might do it, whether it be through journaling, whether it be through deep conversation with loved ones, whether it be through the practice of learning to love people or be in a loving, conscious, aware relationship with people with whom you don't know. We learn about who we are, where we are in those moments, right? And as a result, explore that notion of what it means to be engaged in heart-filled action. And I think that's the transformational nexus point.
Yeah, the heart-filled action coming through those three legs of the stool, coming through that unconditional love. I love the way that you've phrased this, because I think so much of what we look at, what we characterize as revolutionary acts, they can become so externalized, so reactionary. And I think, to note what you spoke of earlier, the sense of radical being a word that actually gets conflated with reactionary now more than anything else, rather than consciousness, groundedness. It's lost that rooted quality.
Yeah. To get back to the ancient knowledge, the ancient foundation and meaning of what it means to be connected within ourselves, but also connected to the depths of who we are, and by nature, to the planet itself, to the earth herself.
Yeah, and in that sense, there's something so powerful that it can be hard to express sometimes, but that's why we have people like Wendell Berry, the renowned author and sustainability advocate that we quoted a lot last episode. This feels potent to bring him into the conversation again. So the following is an excerpt from his 1968 essay, A Native Hill. And in this, he's writing about his relationship to his family home of Henry County, Kentucky, and how that brings about a connection to the earth, to those depths. When I have thought of the welfare of the earth, the problems of its health and preservation, the care of its life, I have had this place before me, the part representing the whole more vividly and accurately, making clearer and more pressing demands than any idea of the whole. When I have thought of kindness or cruelty, weariness or exuberance, devotion or betrayal, carelessness or care, doggedness or awkwardness or grace, I have had in my mind's eye the men and women of this place, their faces and gestures and movements.
So I really love the manner in which Wendell Berry grounds himself in place, how he gives his home of Henry County, Kentucky, that grounded sense of connectedness to his sense of what it means to be on planet Earth. I have a similar experience here at Simplicity, the daily reminder, the sense in that context of feeling grateful, a sense of trust and on a certain level forgiveness to myself and to the world around me by being in this place, this connection to nature, to the trees that are here. And I think there's that context that exists in place. And I think that there's that manner in which it exists in humanity, right? It exists in our bodies, in our being. I recently watched Saving Private Ryan. And there's a conversation that occurs between Captain John Miller and Private Ryan, James Francis Ryan, in which Ryan says to the captain, I can't remember my brothers. I can't see them. Miller goes, well, you need context, right? Miller describes his memory of his wife, of them being outdoors. She's got these big gloves on, and I believe she's gardening. And it's a place that he can go to and connect with her. And in sharing that, it inspires Ryan to share a story, a silly story with he and his brothers. It's very warm, it's humorous, and Ryan really lights up. And you can see in that moment he's connected with his brothers through the context of that memory. And so in that way, this is how this is how the earth, this is how our connection to ourselves, it exists. It exists in the stories that we tell ourselves about who and what we are. It reminds me of actually someone who collaborated with Wendell Berry, a man by the name of Brian Swimmer, who wrote a book called The Universe is a Green Dragon. In the story within the book, Suma describes that over the last 100 years, maybe, since the advent of radio, the nature of the story that humanity has dwelled in has changed. Prior to that, we sat around, we might have been in a longhouse, or around a hearth, or around a bonfire outside, and we told stories of what it meant to be human. Creation stories, but also lovely stories of the harvest, or of weddings gone by, or whatever it might be. Shared experience. What changed with the advent of radio and then TV and now digital media is that the centerpiece of the story is now the advertisement. The one consistent element over the last century has been what's being sold, not what the story at its very intrinsic level is about. Those stories keep coming and going in different forms. But the story of the ad is now central. And it keeps getting repeated over and over and over again into our being. And so it's a story of consumption. And it's become darker and darker and darker now in its expression, because with 8 billion of us on the planet, and while there is abundance, there are finite resources. So the story we dwell in now is of consuming resources at a rate that far exceeds the ability to regenerate those resources, and in many cases, the toxicity that's brought to the planet as a result of the extraction of those resources. So the story we live in now is that of living in a consumptive story that has ultimately led us to our own demise. Whether we see it or not already, this is the story we're in. And as a result, we're the only ones that can change that story. It will require creativity. It will require imagination. I love that Brian Suma uses a dragon within the title of his book, The Universe is a Green Dragon. About a quarter century ago, I was at a dinner party, and on the bookshelf of this friend's home was this book about the notion that dragons are real, that dragons are not just mythical creatures, but that they exist and have unique features that allow them to go undetected. They have an ability to mirror whatever is behind them, so they really can't be seen. They have all these sort of very cosmic being qualities. So I loved this idea, and it fit into my childhood story that came out of a series of books that I read in elementary school titled My Father's Dragon Trilogy by Ruth Stiles. I'd already wanted to believe in dragons, and then I'm reading through this book at this dinner party, and it feels true to me that there's dragons in the world. I shared my father's dragon trilogy with each of my children, but in particular, in this context, with my daughter. She and I have had many conversations around the notion of dragons in the world. And it really doesn't matter whether or not you believe in whether or not dragons are real, that anyone else believes the dragons are real. I know in my heart that there's truth to the notion of dragons. It need not be anyone else's truth. It need not be anyone else's part of their inner story. In the context of what I'm sharing with you today, it fills my heart with possibility. It fills my heart with a sense of ease and joy. It fits in for me with Brian Swimmer's book title, that the universe is a green dragon. So whether I'm speaking in literal or metaphoric terms, it's true. The universe, the world, it is fantastical. It is wondrous beyond belief. And it needs that kind of creative possibility so that we can access and share a kind of unconditional love that needs to be present and rests at the root of this conscious revolution that we're speaking of today.
Thank you, Martin, for sharing that beautiful expression on what happens to be our 50th podcast episode. It's been quite the journey. Here's to much more. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Ben.
Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.